thanks to all of you for joining. And also thank you to the participants of this 2017 conference in Delhi, from which these two volumes emerged. I'm very happy to see the group which met in Delhi for 3 days, 4 days. So it's really nice to see some of you here. And thanks definitely to Abhishek and Christian for accepting to be discussants of these two volumes. So looking forward to uh, what they have got to say, whether we have met the task which we had set for ourselves or not. Um, I don't think so first of all, I think Lena, what we do here at ZMO, and a welcome from ZMO, because this is something, an event, a book discussion event, which we started during the Corona COVID lockdown. And so some of the colleagues whose works have come out from ZMO, so this event emerged out of that collective thinking about engaging around the publications which have happened last year at ZMO. So we also record these events. So if anyone is not willing to give the consent, that person can directly write to Lena, who has this Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner host person in the participant list. Otherwise, we'll take that it's all right with you if we record the event. Uh, but we can follow this up later on email. Um, Pankaj, Nitin, and we will very briefly talk maybe 3-4 minutes each about the volumes and largely about the project, and then we'll give it to Abhishek and Christian, and then perhaps because all most of the contributors are here, it will be nice also if they can chip in at any point. So we want to keep the whole event very sort of conversational and informal. Um, so this project emerged. So this was part of the ERC Starting Grant project, which ran for 3 years between 2015 and 2018. And Nitin Varma and I, we designed this project together in 2014. And one of the pressing things which we felt, because at that time we were working on different issues. Nitin was working on tea plantation economy of 19th century Assam. I was working on histories of transport and communication in colonial India. But in our sources, we were encountering domestic servants in different guises, in different types of sources as well. Nitin was encountering them as a proximate figure between the plantation household and the plantation economy. I was looking at a range of ego documents and travel writings of the early 19th century and of colonial officials, and I was encountering the servants there in my sources, so to say. Something like an officer who had come to join in India in the 1830s or 40s. He's writing a series of 4 letters back to his wife because his wife had inquired, "Tell me about your life in India." And in one letter, he describes his office work, and in the second letter, he describes his domestic setup. And he's making these pencil sketches on the margins of his letter. So these are my servants, and he draws 11 servants in ink. And so we were literally encountering servants. But and then we turned towards the existing historiography of South Asia, which is amazingly rich. Particularly, we were thinking at that time of subaltern history writing, and we were then this question started emerging that why, while having servants in our sources, which is conspicuously present, why conceptually South Asian historiography has not thought of domestic servants? So peasants have been written about, industrial workers have been written about, and other marginal groups' histories were written about. But domestic servant was something which was largely missing. There were certain exceptions, definitely, but it was largely missing in our historiography of labor, in historiography of family, in historiography of domesticity, so to say. So that was our entry point, recognizing both the empirical conspicuous, and I think Nitin would expand on that, what kind of sources and research challenges we faced very briefly. But we did recognize in different types of archives of judicial archives, literary sources, visuals. Yeah, so there are servants, but they haven't been written about. So this project basically emerged with that recognition of this absence, and why and what it meant. So eventually we did two conferences. The first conference which we did was in Delhi in February 2017, and these two volumes which we are going to discuss today, they emerged from that conference. We were not able to include all the papers, but we did include a majority of papers. So we came up with the idea of two volumes. The second thing which I want to highlight before is although project was formally designed to look at the period from mid 18 to mid 28, so we were largely focusing on the colonial slash modern period of South Asian history and historiography. But we were also acutely aware that we cannot do this. We can't parachute into the middle of the 18th century and start talking about servants without having a sense of the long term history. um, there are histories of slavery, there are histories of servitude, which has long genealogies in South Asian past. So we were very keen, we were very aware of the fact that any such account which will emerge from this project as to what understanding of, say, between law, service, and domesticity, or say between labor historiography and the presence of domestic servants during the colonial mechanism, it cannot be properly understood until we know what existed before, how that transmuted over a period of time, and so on. And I do want to say something about the absence which some of us must be feeling today of not having Sunil Kumar amongst us. Sunil was one of the contributors in the first volume, but more than that, he was one of the anchors of this project, I would say, because the first time in 2015, when we got this project, Nitin and I, we contacted him because we want your expertise, and we want your guidance to understand the pre-colonial period or the early modern period. And at that time, we didn't know Pankaj. And it was Sunil who put us in touch with Pankaj. Sunil asked us to meet Pankaj, and I remember we had our first meeting in Delhi. And it's extremely it feels very it's a it's a kind of how to put it, it's a vacuum which I feel when Sunil is not here amongst us today, as some of us know that he very suddenly passed away 2 3 weeks ago in Delhi, and that was quite of a jolt to all of us when we heard that news. So I also want to sort of, in memory of Sunil, and he would have loved to be present here, as he was also present because when we did our first book launch in 2019 in November in India, he made time to come and attend that, and it was very lovely to have him there at CSTS. We had done that. So and Pankaj has a long association with Sunil. So I would just hand over to Pankaj. And so Sunil became an anchor, and he was our sort of go after guy in terms of any query we would have about pre-colonial times. Sunil, can you help us? And yeah, Pankaj, please.
Thanks, Nitin. And yeah, I know, I mean, that was the first thing that occurred to me, that he would have been so excited to be here, to be part of this. I remember when we organized this book talk, 2019, December, I guess. Uh, he had an interview scheduled in Pune for that day, which he could not give up. And when we contacted him, he immediately agreed to shift the time of his flight, and he made all the changes and made sure that directly from the airport he reached the venue of that talk. Uh, In fact, the first time he put me in touch with the two Nitins, he said to me that, I have known these people not for a very long time, but the project that they have discussed with me is absolutely fascinating. And his investment in project was nothing short of personal. Uh, and that's another reason why, on an occasion like this, it's uh, it's very painful. It's very painful to not have him here. Many of us knew him personally, and many others only knew his work. For all of us, it's been a very, very painful loss because although, you know, one passes away, these are inevitable parts of this world. But there was so much academic, so much history, so much life left in him, and it was so completely unexpected that uh, it left us in shock. And yet, on a moment like this, exactly, one would and one should perhaps do exactly what he loved, and that could be the best tribute to him and to the things that he loved. Uh, and Yeah, I mean, precisely when he, for example, mentioned this project to me, apart from the excitement that he shared, one of the things we would often talk about was how this project and our involvement in this project would affect us much beyond the immediate daira, the immediate jurisdiction reach of this project. And that was one of the things that, in fact, kept us glued to the project. I was an outsider. When the project was conceived, I was not part of it. But as we moved into it, and as the first time I started looking at the pre-modern times for the domestic servants, the first question I asked myself was, is there a domestic servant when we talk about the pre-modern times? It was not as obvious a question to me as it was perhaps, for the Nitins, looking at the contemporary and the modern world. And one of the first writings that occurred to that I sort of took another look at was Nitin Kumar's essay on Naukri and Bandi. And although eventually we had to move much beyond it, but that helped to sort of open up the field and to get into different textual understandings of it. But to come back to the original question, one of the uh, prime concerns that I had, and I still think about it, was how does it change the way I think about and do history. And it, for me, it had profound impact in the way I engage with history and the craft of history, the way one looks for sources, the way one thinks of the quote unquote marginalized within history. Uh, for example, from wondering about whether I'll have enough references to domestic servants, within a month or so of looking for sources and discovering archives, I realized that, in fact, the sources might be a little too much for me to handle. That was uh, uh, the amount of material that I discovered without doing much. So one of the things that it kind of sensitized me to was the fact that very often it is because of the kind of narratives that we come across that we fail to notice what is always there, what is ubiquitous. But the way in which we read it is so premeditated that unless and until we go there with a very specific concern or with very specific cultivation of sensitivity, it might be impossible for us to think about it. But the book is there. It already looks old. It already started. Some of the concerns we voiced there already starts appearing dated and in need of revisions. But I guess if it still makes us excited and if it still raises a few questions, it would have been worth the trouble. But I look forward to hear the discussants and the other participants' views on this. So thank you for your patience, and I would now request Nitin Varma to share his impressions before we move on to the discussions.
Yeah, thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, Nitin. So broadly, I've laid the groundwork for the discussion. So I don't want to anticipate too much of the substantive part because we will go into the details, the two discussants, Abhishek Kaikar and Christian Divito. So I don't want to anticipate or kind of, already start answering questions they haven't asked yet. So, but I'll just one other point that I want to emphasize what Nitin was saying about the importance of the topic, considering its importance in contemporary India, the question of domestic servants and the literature in contemporary India. It seemed that, of course, there was a lot of research being done, it sparked a lot of discussion in the last 20, 30 years, but that sort of absence in the work of historians. So historians of South Asia, unlike historians of other regions of the world, be it Europe, Latin America, Africa, the importance of domestic service is quite crucial in the writing of those histories. So we found this inexplicable. So we were basically very, that was one of the sort of the main interests why we started working on this topic. And when we started this research, the other aspect which became very obvious was in that short span of time that we had in 3 years, it was very difficult to cover the ground in terms of having a more general conception of this. So this whole attempt to bring people together, people who are working on other topics, and to look through their material with this new lens, what Pankaj was also mentioning, this new sensibility that allowed us to have this wide array of contributions for the pre-modern period and the modern period, which helps us now, definitely helps us to understand this much better than when we started this project. So this aspect of collaboration has been very crucial for us. And I hope this spirit of collaboration continues. And there are other younger scholars, and of course, even older ones, who join us and or take their own initiative to work on this topic, which we think is extremely crucial to understand the social history of South Asia and the process of social change. So I just want to put this on the table, and we can come back to the more substantive issues after the discussion. So I would like to invite Abhishek first to offer his comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I audible? Great. So I just want to begin by expressing a word of congratulations to you on this really fantastic assemblage of scholarship that arrived serendipitously on my desk a year or two ago, which was really a breath of fresh air and something that I had not anticipated or thought about as a path in the history of South Asia. And so I think that, even though Pankaj has already expressed a sense of perhaps slight fatigue with the work that he has recently done, I want to say that from my perspective, from the perspective of an outsider to the project, this is really refreshing and new, and it poses challenges and questions for us to grapple with that I think we need to take very seriously in the history of South Asia, and obviously also in those histories that speak to the history of South Asia, as well as also those that don't. So I don't have very many formal remarks, but I do have some points that I'd like to raise and a couple of small provocations. And I think I'd just like to sort of present them in no particular order and leave them to you, which I'd love to hear more about, to start a discussion, really. So for me, I think one of the major contributions, and I think an absolutely wonderful feature of this project as it was conceived, is to put directly into conversation the history of pre-modern India with the history of modern India. And I think that's just such an enormous conceptual move, in a world where we deeply segregate the so-called medieval history of India from the so-called modern history of India, and to situate really tight attention on the late 18th century and the early 19th century, I think is just a really important move, and one that needs to be sort of thought about and conceptualized. And it raises, for me at least, the question as a scholar of the 18th century, it raises the question of what the weight of the deep past of South Asia is at the moment of the establishment of colonialism, particularly with regard to the question of servants, but not only with regard to the question of servants, more broadly, in thinking in broader historical terms, if we were to sort of situate ourselves at this fulcrum of the establishment of colonialism, which really does seem to be a sort of fulcrum in the project as it is conceived, then it's a sort of real question about, what for instance, the 2000-year past of Buddhism, how it weighs upon those people who are beginning to grapple with the question of servitude in South Asia. And I don't, I offer no answers to that question. I simply just sort of raise it as something that I think is intriguing and important for myself. I think another really interesting feature of the work for me was the sort of dedicated focus on the figure or the conception of servants as opposed to what might be a more sort of flashy, easy, and fashionable move, which is to think about questions of servility. And it's sort of an interesting move to make, I think, to focus on ideas of servants rather than notions of servility as such. And it's sort of remarkable that in almost every single essay on the pre-modern period, there is a real attempt to engage with the actual lives of actual individuals and actual servants in the past. And this, of course, raises questions in terms of methodology for me, and questions about the ways in which this work seeks to engage with the categories of social history, or cultural history, or particularly microhistory, in the sense that it seems to me that there is a kind of concerted move away from some of the more familiar moves that cultural historians such as myself are prone to making. And on the one hand, a kind of serious attention to questions of social history, but on the other hand, real use of the techniques of microhistory. And that's a very interesting move to make. And I'm sort of curious about what the motivations were. And I was hoping that we would be less coy than some of the introductions are in framing answers to what precisely the motivations were for this. And for me, of course, it's very valuable because I've long held that in the history of pre-modern South Asia, we have moved so facilely from political and economic history to cultural history without the intervening attention to social history in the pre-modern history of South Asia. So that, in a sense, just the focus on social history itself is enormously important. And I was wondering how much the fact that this ERC project with a home in Berlin, derives from or touches on the kind of direction towards questions of social history. It's obviously a storied tradition in Germany, as opposed to the question of, say, subaltern studies. And I noticed that there are, characteristically South Asian, careful, modulated, short, puzzlingly short engagements with the question of subaltern studies in both of these volumes. And in a sense, to say that because servants are missing from subaltern studies, this is an attempt to sort of rectify that historiography, is to hide the ambition of the project, right? And is to, in a sense, cast a veil over the stakes of the work. And so I'm very curious, and I would really just love to hear a little bit more about perhaps some of those discussions that shape the directions of making a move away from subaltern studies. And this is particularly important because it's not as if subaltern studies does not have the capacity, particularly in its later iterations, in a sense, to describe all social relations of all kinds among all people at all times on this planet and presumably all other planets, right? And nevertheless, it's very clear that the language of subaltern studies, in some instances, is very clearly present in this work. So, for instance, paradigms of domination and subordination, particularly as they appear in the question of the colonial period, clearly derive from subaltern studies. So I just, I want to sort of ask a little bit more about this. And also, for myself as a historian of pre-modern South Asia, to raise questions about the kind of conceptual tension that obviously must inhabit any volume, given the fact that the paradigms of subaltern studies were never designed to work for, were explicitly stated that they did not apply to and did not engage with the question of the pre-colonial, right? And so, in a sense, there's a kind of conceptual richness and a possibility and a tension that comes from, a pre-modern engagement, which is, I say this without comment, but thicker in purely material ways than the modern, where questions of subaltern studies do not apply. So that's sort of interesting. The question of archives is another fascinating question. In the case of the pre-modern, I think one of the main great contributions of this volume has been to really expand our concept of what an archive of the history of South Asia in the pre-modern period could look like. And I'm thinking particularly of all of the kinds of work that come from the Rajasthan archives, but also the collections of epistolary documents and the Hindi documents that really are fantastic. And I think that, for a historian of the Mughal Empire who's also invested in the question of expanding the archives by which we work on the Mughal Empire, I think that this volume poses an important way forward, but it's clearly only the first step in truly expanding the archives by which we might approach the question. And in a sense, I think the volume also points or rubs up very sharply against the limitations of using familiar sources to ask unfamiliar questions, right? And this is a technique that all of us do, in a sense. Pre-modern historians of South Asia have more in common with classicists than historians of other parts of the world at the same time. We work on a known and small corpus of texts frequently. But I think that this volume really does push us to think more broadly, particularly Mughal historians, about larger frameworks, about different kinds of sources, and how to read those sources in different kinds of ways. The question of the conceptualization of servants in the pre-modern period, to which Pankaj alluded, I think is really important. Very clearly, the figure of the waged servant laborer, the domestic female laborer, as she emerges in the colonial archive, is quite different from the world of the pre-modern servant. And here, let me take my own moment to also just remember Sunil Kumar, who was, I saw him as a teacher and a friend, and I know that he was a colleague and a mentor and a teacher and a friend to many of you. And I just want to note that I also profoundly miss his absence, and I was very much looking forward to seeing him here today, which was one of the main reasons that I wanted to be here, so I could say, hi, Sunil, how have you been? And I'm just very sorry, very, very sorry at his absence here. So my condolences to all of you. But, Sunil's conception of the historical understanding of servitude, and again, not servility, interestingly, was a sort of sophisticated and refined conception. And yet, when I, were Sunil here, I would want to ask him whether it would be possible to think about non-elite forms of servitude in the pre-modern period, right? Because the forms of servitude that we see in the pre-modern period, in a sense, remind one of the famous Booger, Bob Dylan song, everybody's a servant, you got to serve somebody. All are servants of someone else. All are servants of God. And so, in this language and in this world, is it possible to actually see servants and servitude in ways that the colonial archive makes very, very possible, right? And if it's not possible, how do we actually square the problem of only visions of elite servitude until 1750? and then, the vanishing of elite servitude and the kind of domestic personal servitude that appears in the colonial archive. Can we synchronize these questions into a coherent narrative? And I think more broadly, that raises the question for me with which I began, which is the question of really synchronizing and linking and making cohere the pre-modern past with the modern with the modern period, and how we might actually do that, and what future conversations you are planning to have that will actually draw materially on the really rich, deep past of South Asia in material forms on the question of, say, the 19th century, but also the present day, right? And as a scholar of the 18th century, I'm firmly convinced, of course, that the deep past is indeed very much present in histories of South Asia, perhaps in ways that are unique or different or special in South Asia, but that do deserve to be explored. And I think in that sense, beginning that conversation between the pre-modern and the modern, for me, is one of the most welcome and laudable contributions of this volume, which I welcome. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Abhishek. And now I invite Christian De Vito, and then we'll carry the conversation further.
Right. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me. And I also want to start by congratulating all the editors of the two volumes, and all the authors of the two volumes there, and of the participants in the project there. This is really an important project and important books. And just to give a definition of what an important book is for me, I would say that important books are those that somehow allow to discuss broader issues, even broader than the scope of the books themselves. And I think this is one such case, and that's a big compliment, but I think it's completely well deserved. At the same time, I think that important books, they deserve honest critiques and honest feedback. And this is what I will try to do, of course, as a total outsider, in the sense that I am not an expert either of domestic service and work, and also not of South Asia. So I take this perspective, and you should know this. But what is really important here is that the points I will try to raise are 3 points, basically. One is about the relationship between the history of domestic service and social history, a broader project of social history. The second one is about this project here and the volumes we have, and the question of global history. And the third one is about the question of temporality, how we conceptualize temporality. I think that the two volumes, they do a great work in all the three fields, and this is amazing. I mean, it's not something that usually happens. But let me start with the first point. So the question of the history of domestic service and social history. I think there is a clear tension here in the two volumes, and it starts, of course, with a general introduction by the editors in the first volume. It's a clear tension in search for a social history of domestic service, and at the same time in search for a new social history through the perspective of domestic service. And if we take these 2 points, I think that the questions that are in the general introductions are very relevant. So as you have reminded us also in your introduction today, I mean, you started from asking yourself, why have domestic servants not been adequately studied so far? Then you go into the question of how to study domestic servants, and you went also in the question of why should we study domestic servants? But I think there is another question which is really there in the volumes and not in the general introduction, and that is, how does the study of domestic servant in South Asia change key interpretation in labor and social history of South Asian and beyond? And this is really a contribution that the two volumes do. And it's a very important point. And you, on page 44 of the general introduction, it's very clearly stated. You think that one of the reasons why there has not been this attempt to go into the household and into domestic service is because both radical Marxists and Gramscian subalternists, as you put that, never turned their gaze into that, because looking at the household would have denied any easy access to conceptual tools based on binaries. This is what you say, and I think you have a big point there. And this brings me really into what I consider the most important point of the entry point of domestic service. Domestic service really goes into the households, and it brings to this question of the intimacy that goes together with social distance. And this is an amazing entry point into social history more broadly of Southern Asia, but also more generally. And you have this point central definitely in volume 2, but it actually goes across the whole volume. And it is the question that basically all the contributions from their specific entry points, they give us this perspective. And this is, of course, something that this intimacy and social distance, how can you have both? And what happens when you are in that situation that you are a servant in a household, but at the same time, and you are so intimate with the master and mistress, but at the same time so distant. This is the key thing, I think. And this is an amazing perspective, both for the social history of domestic service and for social history more broadly. Because while you definitely have a contribution there to the social history of domestic service, you clearly say a lot of important things regarding the notions of caste, notions of honor, notions of morality of empire, and how the empire presented itself as moral, notions of slavery, and notions of reproduction of a master-servant relationship within this context. These are all elements that you mentioned explicitly in the second introduction, in the introduction of volume 2, but these are all elements that are deeply addressed in virtually all the essays in this question. So you can go from this perspective, you enter an amazing range of topic. For example, this question, which for a labor historian as I am, is also very important. So the question of how can a contractual, transactional, and professionalized relationship go together with this kind of reproduction of a master-servant relationship deep into the 19th century and even in the 20th century and even now. So how, and again, this is very much related to this question of intimacy, patronage, and social distance, keeping social distance in a place that is actually very, very close, where closeness is the key thing. And these are very important things because at the same time, you have this perspective from within the household, but at the same time, as you say also in the general introduction, and I found that a very important point, that's on page 23 of the general introduction, the servants were the bearers and the carriers of the prestige of the households, and therefore the master's and mistress authority outside the household. So it is again a question of how this intimacy and this construction of subjectivity and also subjugation within the household, how then it is projected outside the household through the very concrete persons of the servants. So this is the amazing, I think, if I have to summarize what I think it's the key contributions of these volumes to social history generally, this is really the point. And of course, one part of this is that it allows us to go into methodological issues regarding social history. And the methodological issues relate to what the colleague has just highlighted regarding the sources and how we treat them, and the fact that your sources across the volumes are so broad. You go from judicial archives to oral history, you approach the literary narratives as sources. And if you go in the pre-modern period, then you have a whole range of other sources, as Abhishek has just reminded us. I won't go into this, but this is clearly very, very important. But the other thing which is very, very important is that this perspective allows you to go more deeply into the question of agency, because clearly you want to do this. You don't just want to write a history of domestic service and social history from this perspective, but you also want to do that from the perspective of the servants. And this is an additional point. And this would have been very problematic if, of course, you had not approached the question of agency in such a sophisticated way as you do in the introductions and in virtually all the contributions. Because here we have an interjection by Lucy Delep, which tells us a lot about the question of agency, lateral agency, ambivalent agency, distributed agency. But we also have all the question of agency and resistance in the general introduction. We have the question of agency as one section even of your introduction to volume 2. So what I want to say, the question is clearly there. And what we see here is that the concept of agency, although you want to retain that somehow, but even in this most sophisticated approach, it is still very problematic as such. And you are clearly aware of all these problems that the concept brings with them, but somehow you want to retain that. And this is an interesting tension that is all through the why is that problematic? First of all, because somehow, let's be clear about this. The concept of agency is an offensive concept to the subalterns. Why would we want to search for this, sort of obsessively search for the agency of the subaltern as if it's something that should be shown, as if it's something that could eventually not be there? Of course it is there, but somehow we have this prejudice that only the other parts, the counterparts, have some sort of agency. And that's why we go into this sophisticated idea of agency without really thinking that agency, of course, is there. But if we go into the question of agency just like that, then we forget several things. One is that the subaltern agency is not the same as resistance. I mean, there is a lot of subaltern agency that is not about resistance, but condescendence, going on, reproducing the system, reproducing the hierarchical things. And the other thing is that it is always relational. So whatever agency is, it cannot be like separated, the subaltern agency from the agency of the counterpart. And this is why I think that the most productive way across the volumes where we see what you mean actually from taking the perspective of the servant is very interesting, where the concept of agency is not used. And this would be, to me, the essay, the contributions by Nitin Varma, which takes the perspective of microhistory and takes these cases of these 3 examples of lives of these ayahs and life trajectories. And exactly because it is seen there as a continuous relationship of what was going on in that context and not a separated agency of the subaltern, then it works very nicely to show how this process of domestic labor, of domestic service, was actually constructed by this continuous interaction and contestation and conflict within the household and beyond the household. So because these are relational practices rather than just agency by the subaltern. I don't know if this is clear, but I think this is a very important point if we want to understand domestic service from the perspective of the servants, and more generally, if we want to approach social history from the perspective of the subaltern, because this was also, I think, a key problem in history from below. I mean, in the kind of social history that has been written from below, with the assumption that there is something from below that can be considered separately from what was going on in society more broadly. And I think the virtuous part of these volumes are those where this kind of idea of from below and of agency are somehow connected to the broader perspective. So this was the first point. I will be briefly on the other points, but they are similarly important. The second point is about the question of global history. You say very clearly that there has been a domestic term in South Asian social history. Well, I think from the perspective, from the scholarship that you mentioned also in the introduction, etc., I think what we face is a domestic term more generally in social history more generally. I mean, we have these studies by Jane Whittle on servants in Europe. We have these studies on this volume on colonization and domestic service by Askins and Laurie that goes broader than just South Africa. We have these projects on contemporary domestic labor. For example, I know this project by Sabrina Marchetti, Dom Equal. These are all things that are going on at the same time, and they clearly tell us of this broader domestic term. And of course, the contribution by Raffaella Sarti in volume 1 points to the importance of all this. But my point here is, what does this broader domestic term more globally tell us about the possibility to rewrite the relationship between the metropole and the colonies? And so through the perspective, of course, of domestic labor. I mean, of course, we know that there was a circulation of people and ideas around domestic service in metropole and colonies. We know that there were colonial subjects in the households in the metropolis, and we know that the colonial imaginaries are still there with us in the former metropoles when we get to post-colonial migrations. But the other point is very much like discourses and practices of radical dependency and otherness on the working force in Europe in connections of what happened in the colonies. I mean, can we really understand domestic servitude in Europe as something completely different from domestic servitude in the colonies? Were the domestic servants in Europe really treated in a way that was different from what was there in the colonies? Or do we have to write this history as a more connected history of the subaltern classes more generally? And this is, of course, again, something that we look here from the perspective of domestic service, but maybe it is the case that we have to write more connected histories of the subaltern classes in the metropole and in the colonies more generally. Because if you look at what was there, even in the 19th century, the literature and the practices of how the subaltern groups within Europe were treated, and the kind of colonial ideologies that was there when they were talking about the peasants in Italy, in Spain, in France, in the UK, how different was there really from the discourses and practices that were projected and addressed in the colonies. And the last point is about the chronology and the periodization. There is an amazing subtle and highly sophisticated understanding here in these volumes of periodization, and what Abhishek has just referred to in terms of the pre-colonial, colonial, it is really a big example of that. And you, several times across the volumes, you mention non-linear, complicated and contested processes, and therefore the need to go beyond this idea of a linear understanding of linear shifts across time, etc. And yet, why is volume 2 constructed thematically and volume 1 constructed chronologically? And why do we have a volume which is there for the pre-colonial and colonial period, and another one which somehow goes into the deeper colonial and post-colonial period? That is important, and I'm not saying as a critique, because in fact, I think that exactly this point on intimacy and social distance within the household is in an amazing perspective that allow you to go beyond this kind of chronological separation. But I would have expected somehow a thematical organization of the two volumes rather than of the second volume. And the other amazing entry point, and I conclude here, is this question of the semantic approach that you have there, that is there definitely in your general introduction, which is amazing stable with all the kind of concepts that are used throughout the time, but also, of course, across the other contribution, especially in the second part of the volume 2, where you have this literary understanding of that, and therefore not only language, but the semantics comes in so importantly. There again, semantics as a field of conflict, and not just as sort of representation of an ideology, but each concept is contested, and therefore, again, the temporality is broken because different subjects and different historical actors had a different understanding of what was meant, and they conflicted around the use of that. This is very much what you see in the court sources, of course, but this is of course also there when literary sources get in. This is there when you see oral history. It's all about this contestation. So I would say that this intimacy and social distance question, and on the other hand, the entry point of the semantics, these are amazing entry points for a much longer term broken temporality there. And the volume does that, the volumes do that, but the provocative question, if you like, is why is this sort of remnants still there of a sort of approach that divide the period across, let's say, sort of more traditional disciplinary divide and therefore chronological divides? Sorry, I've been too long. I leave it to the discussion. I'm very, very interested to hear all of you, not only on my comments and Abhishek's, but on whatever you like to do, because this is so important to discuss these topics. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Christian. Because we have got a lot of contributors here, and which is really very exciting to see. If they want to start with any of the points which Abhishek and Christian have raised, that's also, I mean, we don't need to abuse the power of the editorial privilege. So contributors should also feel equally welcome to just chip in. And I see Professor Uma is there, Samita is there, a lot of Rafaela is there. Can't see everyone on the one page, but yeah, please, if you feel like if there's a particular point which Abhishek and Christian made, which you directly would like to.
If nobody else is venturing, then I'll just say we have two brief responses. One is to Christian. I think the issue of intimacy and social distance that he has discussed has been for me also the most important entry point. And in an earlier work that I had done, which is not historical, which is contemporary, in this, I call it pragmatic intimacy, as a way to talk about how there are claims and contestations on the relationship of intimacy itself, and how that the contradiction between the intimacy and social distance works out in everyday relationships also. And I would add to that, it's not just intimacy, it is also proximity. It is a level of proximity, especially increasingly in urban, contemporary urban India, where houses are getting, it's a real physical proximity, where homes are getting smaller, where families are also smaller, but nevertheless the physical environment itself creates a level of proximity which has not perhaps been there, which was not there earlier. Anyway, so that's I don't want to go on and on, but I do think that I agree completely with Christian that I think is a very, very important entry point into the question. Also, that globality, I think, is a absolutely, and I think some of the essays in these two volumes do draw that out a little bit, especially colonial legislation. Because so much of the master servant legislation which governed domestic workers in the early colonial, in the 19th century, are clearly drawn from British and European legal traditions. Just briefly to Abhishek's question about subaltern studies, I wanted to respond to this because very recently somebody else has asked me that question about why I have worked on labor for 25 years without using the term subaltern. And my answer to that would be that I will use, the question is not why I should not use subaltern. The question is, I will use subaltern if subaltern studies framework has something to offer me, which will answer the questions I wish to ask, or will help me navigate the terrain that I wish to navigate. And I've always felt that it didn't. The only history book we have on the subject before Nitin and Nitin initiated this project was Shapna Banerjee's book. And one of the ways in which Shapna Banerjee negotiated the question, though she did her work elsewhere, she started her work under Partha Chatterjee, and I think she will also admit that Professor Chatterjee had a very important influence on that work. That the entry point into that is elite sources. And the basic argument is about the identity of middle class, the formation of the articulation of the identity of the middle class vis-a-vis the relationship with the domestic servants. Now, if you actually want to work on servants, and I take Christian's point that agency should not be thought of in such simple terms, but nevertheless, to turn that lens, I never felt that subaltern studies offered me the tools that I needed to do this work. And that is the simple reason that one doesn't use. I mean, one would not use subaltern studies. The use of subaltern studies is not the purpose of this exercise. So it would only be valuable to use subaltern studies if it helps us in the exercise that we wish to undertake.
Pankaj or Nitin, do you want to add something quickly before somebody else also makes an intervention?
Yeah. Okay. So while other participants are, I guess, still mulling over some of those issues, I must say that I must thank Abhishek and Christian for extremely interesting, critical comments. I take uh, the commandments and the appreciations with humility, but um, uh, the more substantive parts, quite predictably, were the critical ones that you somehow still managed to put forth in very appreciative mode. But uh, to begin with the question that Samita also framed, which is the issue of intimacy and social distance, uh, uh, and the subaltern archives and methods, I have three things to say, to 3 points to make in this context. The first is that very often when we tend to use terms like subaltern or labor history and so on, we somehow tend to think of it as a single set of uh, you know craft related or method related maneuvers. Very often, much of subaltern historiography, as for example the labor history, Marxist historiography, and cultural history, and so on, has actually become part of our everyday methods, even though they were probably first popularized, if not established, by one of these schools. So, for example, thinking of intimacy and social distance, I think my first brush with the idea historiographically that you could look at emotions and emotionally thick relations in in critical light and put them under the scanner was perhaps somewhere you know uh, initiated by some of the subaltern writings. But more specifically, when I look at, and this brings me to Abhishek's question uh, of the fact that when we think of speaking, the speaking, uh, when we think of conceptualizing a conversation between medieval and modern, or pre-modern and modern, or early modern and modern, what are the challenges and difficulties, and why it is, as he rightly pointed out, that from the political we jumped to the social, to the cultural, without the intervening or at least without the uh, equally profound category of the social history, apart from blaming it on sources and the unavailability of information. One of the reasons why we perhaps were not able to do so was also probably because of the absence, physically, not conceptually, absence historiographically of subaltern interventions in the pre-modern period. But to me, the when I look at these early modern and pre-modern sources, one of the things that occurred to me, which goes against and that's interesting, which goes against the grain of what Shamita was suggesting for the modern period, which is that in many of the pre-modern sources, in fact, far more than proximity, far more than pragmatic uh, mm, intimacy, what I come across is power relations constitutive of intimacy. You cannot imagine intimacy without actually an inbuilt social distancing. I mean, take the idea, for example, of kutumb. We are living in the under the tyranny of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The very idea of kutumb is thoroughly hierarchized. You cannot imagine a kutumb, because kutumb refers to the upper caste landed household. So you cannot imagine a kutumb without a servant there, without a service provider who cannot even cross the threshold of the household. He is part of the kutumb. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that, and yet there are people crying for people crying, very genuinely crying for the loss of or pain to such a person. Within this context, then, when we think of the agency of, or quote unquote, historiographically recovering the agency of such a person who is not allowed to cross the threshold of the house, and yet is part of the family, and yet is critically engaged in intimate relations. It's not just merely the fact of instrumentally recovering that agency, to respond to Christian's point, but it also is a innate move, a historiographically counterintuitive move to go against the grain of the narrative in your sources. And that you cannot do unless you willfully, somewhat artificially force yourself to do. And that's the reason, at least in much of the literary archive of the pre-modern times, one has to make that somewhat artificial looking move, which you're absolutely right, Christian, in pointing out, on the face of it, conceptually, it appears like a condescending exercise on the part of the historian to claim that here is agency. Because that agency has been effectively and almost completely invisibilized in the manner in which the narratives confront us from our pre-modern past. So, lastly, I would say that, sorry, we have not talked about, I mean, I mentioned in the beginning, and some of you have referred to this indirectly, which is the global context, and also the ways in which this project and putting the category of servants, and as Abhishek pointed out, and I'm glad that he noticed this, because till now I haven't come across anyone else who noticed this, that this project kind of privileges the category of servant over servitude or servility. And this was, I must say, a very willful move on our part. I remember particularly a conversation that the three of us had, initiated by Nitin Sinha, where it was agreed that for us, the more important issue was to recover lives as much as possible, real life moments, the person of the servant, wherever it was available, or at least we could talk in those terms. But in the context of the global history, and specifically with reference to Rafaela's very meditative piece at the end of the first volume on Can the Historians Speak? I think it's very and equally important for us to think also in terms of where the subject position of the historian lies when we think of ourselves vis-a-vis the lost histories of the servant. Because if the subject position of the domestic servant employing householders discussing the past and presumably the present of the domestic servant is under the scanner, then all of us are more or less under the scanner. And that's one very, very important, very troubling question that I guess comes out of this volume. And that's one question that I hope other people would also think about and share their thoughts about. Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaj. I see two hands, Rafaela and Shikha, Satyashikha, both are contributors. So Rafaela, you go first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I only would like to make a little comment on the issue of global history and um, the domestic turn who was mentioned by Christian. It seems to me that this we should mention women's and gender history, because when women's and gender history started, the domestic and the private was seen as something that which was more or less outside history. In a sense, the real history was not the history of the domestic. It seems to me that 40 or 50 years of research have now completely changed our historical perspective. And it seems to me this is a big success of gender and women history, because now we can really see how the domestic and the public, so to say, are not separate sphere, but are really intermingled, mixed, and the hierarchies are built, are constructed first in the domestic first, or in a large part in the domestic sphere. So in this sense, also this dynamic of intimacy and power relationship is crucial in the domestic sphere, but the domestic sphere is also crucial for the construction of the power itself, also in the public, in a sense. From this point of view, it seems to me that's also interesting, the issue of globalization, because not only because it's important to compare how to compare more precisely how servers were treated in Europe and in the colonies, but also because movement, migration of people who were destined to serve in the colonies from Europe were crucial in the colonization processes, and also other movement of people. In the first phase, there were a lot of people who migrated from Europe in the colonies to colonize, and a large part of these people were servants themselves. So in a sense, there was a contradiction, because there were agents in a sense of imperialism, of colonialism, but they were nonetheless servants. At the same time, a lot of domination within the domestic sphere in the colonies was a kind of laboratory of the construction of racial hierarchies, with this contradiction, or with this with this coexistence of intimacy and distance, intimacy and power relationship. So only this point. Thank you.
Satishka?
Yeah, I have a general question that ties to some of the points raised by the discussants and the contributors. So, something that I often find myself struggling with as I work on the history of the Indian Ayah. As historians, we are usually urged to think about the larger questions, right? The more important questions like nationalism, capitalism, empire, and constantly tie in our smaller research projects to these bigger ideas. So how does someone who wishes to write a social history of servants play the balancing act of addressing the larger questions, but in the process not erase and marginalize the actual life stories of servants? Because firstly, if we if we focus exclusively on the life stories of domestic servants, there is the danger of getting dismissed as too descriptive, right? Rather than being argumentative. And secondly, because servants rarely wrote themselves. The archives about servants, mostly colonial state records, legal records, or employers' writings, the nature of the sources tend to push us in the direction of making arguments about servility rather than servants, right? About domestic service and the law, or middle class employers' self construction, as Swapna Banerjee's work does, or larger arguments about colonial labor, colonial capitalism, and in the process, the actual life stories of domestic servants get lost. So, how do we centralize the lives and labors of servants, their lived experiences, their perspectives, as we make larger historical arguments? That's like a general, question, and something that I guess we all are struggling with.
Nitin, you want to come on that? We were discussing this earlier as well. Um, yeah.
No, actually, exactly. That's. I was so surprised that the things that we were discussing today, and me and Nitin had a discussion, because now that we have done this book and it's been a couple of years, so when you go back to this, then you tend to understand also because of other contributions, and that we have also drawn from other contributions. Gradually, it took time for us to understand few things that initially there were certain things which was driving the project. Of course, as Abhishek also clearly kind of started that this, very direct conversation with the early agenda of subaltern studies definitely was something one was thinking about it. But I don't think we stayed with it for very long, realizing that exactly because it did not give us an handle to what we're trying to do. Sort of, it just became one of these issues which came up initially in our discussion, but we did not really take that as a more sort of important historiography to grapple with, to think about the question at hand. But the other issue, exactly this issue of intimacy and social distance that Christian was raising, exactly this was the point we were discussing today, that we realized that this seems to be like a very important way of thinking about it in a more sort of longue durée perspective. And that it seems that, of course, we need to give it more thought, but this whole aspect of intimacy and social distance seems extremely productive to think about as an entry point. But the other issue which Christian alluded to was also something that we discussed not today, but like in our recent conversations about this sort of the writing of metropolitan histories, and how the question of quote unquote sort of colonial experiences of servitude. So if we think about sort of a very prominent example through which we understand histories of domestic service, or the history of Britain, which have produced excellent social historical work, in the last sort of 50, 60 years, we have several excellent examples. But one thing we realized over a period of time, that they hardly engage with the experiences in the Caribbean, India, Africa, that sort of does not play a part in the understanding or the making of this relationship in the metropolitan itself. So we found this extremely surprising, considering there were people who have written several books on the topic, but somehow this never occurred to them that this also might be an important side to understand the making of this relationship. So it was sort of very much self-contained in their own sort of quote unquote local histories. So in some ways that has also been an important inspiration methodologically to this kind of sort of more micro-historical approaches, questions social history, Thompsonian social history, works of Caroline Steedman, for instance. But then we realized their complete sort of absence of any kind of bearing of the colonial experiences on the making of this relationship. So this became very evident on the rereading of these work, so that for us it becomes so crucial not to miss this. This is we always kind of keep thinking about relationships in Britain, because that through legal sort of norms, as Samita was mentioning, it was constantly being codified in the colonial system. The British master servant laws became very important ways of regulating legally. So this is something we cannot ignore. We have to constantly deal with this historiography, and because it is co-constitutive in some very crucial ways. But we believe it's co-constitutive the other way around. So these experiences was something we also found was missing. So maybe I just want to place this here and yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. If I can just add before anyone else also wants to, just feel free to raise the hand. But I just wanted to come back also on the issue of conceptualizing this project and the role of subaltern. And I can only speak for myself, having worked on some of the labor themes earlier. There was a definite, at least for me, there was a definite seduction of early subaltern. Which was, as I have understood, early subaltern was more structural in its methodological approach. The irony is that once we started understanding that it is it is very difficult to find a servant subject in the archives as a readily formed subject. And rather than chasing this subject, we have to perhaps more importantly look at the relationship. Now, within subaltern historiography, subaltern as a category or a metaphor of relationship emerged in the late subaltern volumes. And that was the point when I lost my interest in late subaltern, because I think it was making it too elastic, right? So I was positioned in a way that my charm with subaltern studies was actually with the early subaltern studies where things were structural. But for this project, we needed to look at the digits or texture or the feel of that relationship. So the late subaltern was definitely not going to be helpful, because it just as I'm not I mean so many people wrote the decline of subaltern in the subaltern studies, so and I completely agree with that part where the late subaltern historiography has been criticized for all rightful reasons. So that's why we find that we don't need to invest so much of time in dealing with that historiography per se. um, Coming back to so just tying up what Satyashikha was asking, and what Christian was saying, yes, so we had these twin projects combined together. One, having made ourselves aware broadly of the different world regions studies, work of Rafael Asati, work of Caroline Steedman and others, there's a glaring gap in South Asian historiography. So first was that we want to do the social history of domestic servants, where we look at language, where we look at material objects, where we look at law, where we look at laughter, different ways of thinking about weaving a social story of on this theme. The other was what does this do to the existing historiography of South Asia? How do we use this understanding, this body of work? What Satyashika perhaps rephrased in a different way. How do we fit it into to bring it in conversation with analytical histories of capitalism, empire, and so on? Again, I don't have a definite answer to that. But the thing which I have realized until now, and it might change again, is that the history of domestic servant is going to be perennially constituted through conflictual interactions. um, it is it is social distant, but it is proximate. It is um, it is in the domestic, but it shapes the template of the relationship for the outside. So this kind of constant struggle which is happening in the history of the figure of domestic servant, I think that's where, if perhaps one lays that out, there's a history of laughter and then there's a history of law, as Samita was saying. And once we get into legislative history of domestic servants, we have to inevitably start from master servant regulation applied across the empire from the late 18th, early 19th century. So that history is, we can call it global, but that history is by its nature transnational, so to say. It's imperial. So I think placing this history in this constant flux of reconstitution through different conflicting factors is in itself perhaps a good start. But yeah, I will remain modest on that ground. Uh, Last point Christian raised, very interesting. So this, practical organization of the volumes in terms of why not thematic clusters, and why we finally opted for the chronological sort of. We did try putting papers in thematic clusters, and I remember Nitin and I, over discussed, and then we thought, no, let's play conventional. Let's have two volumes and place them chronologically. To invent a more serious answer, I of late have been thinking, I don't know, I mean, we all have our phases of being a historian and trying to also look at what we want from history in that sense, right? um, there is not there's not there's It is not such a bad thing to understand the patterns of changes and continuities. It is not such a bad thing to understand the patterns of changed continuities and continuous changes. So in certain sense, I mean, I'm not so much now, it's very important to say that, oh, we shouldn't think in linear fashion, and that's all we have we are trying to say in the introduction as well, because we are trying to play to highlight this idea of graded past. And by graded, we actually meant that the elements of the pre-modern will figure or refigure or get reconfigured into the modern elements. So there's a constant dialogue happening through the process of reconfiguration. But on the other hand, having a long view over a period of 400 years, where we can perhaps mark out certain moments where we see some obvious changes, where we see some new processes acquiring new meanings. I think that was the reason why we decided to play safe. But that's a good point to further think along. Yana, I see Yana's hand raised, and Shalini. Yeah, Yana first.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating discussion. I want to take up the point of connected and global history. And as someone who has really worked with this approach of connected history, I also want to point a bit to its limits, because I think what we really can do for the early 19th century is to write a connected history of social disciplinary techniques, targeting subaltern classes, both in metropolitan and colonial contexts. So the kind of questions of policing, questions of education of the poor, like of the Foucauldian disciplinary techniques, I think there we can find like connections in the circulation of such kind of knowledge and techniques. But I think and this is something which I also really learned from this fantastic project on servants past, is to also see like the fundamental disconnect, like which we can see like from the experiences of the British in India. So how they try to kind of reproduce a kind of domesticity which somehow realigns with the British ideal of domesticity, and which can never be reproduced in a colonial context. And to some extent, of course, they don't want to reproduce it, but they kind of try to realign it and have like domestic service organized in a way that is more familiar to them. And it doesn't work because the regime of organizing domestic labor is so fundamentally different. And I think this, how the volumes go beyond like this kind of, let's say, concentration on the colonial household and look at all kinds of different households. This, I think, also really helps to understand in a comparative way how different regimes of domestic labor are organized and are changing. And this, so this comparison, I think, was more implicit in the two volumes, but still it is there, and I found it highly interesting.
Thank you. Shalini, you wanted to?
Now, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. So really a very big thank you to everyone, the discussants, and to Nitin, both the Nitins and Pankaj, and also a really big thank you for including me in this volume as the only anthropologist who works on the contemporary period. You know, to have become part of this group of historians is a real privilege for me. I think what made it so comfortable, I have to say, is that there was such a chemistry with the historians combining anthropology and history, because I've had references in the past when I was submitting articles on my work on expatriates and post-colonial labor markets, saying that, well, what does the expatriate have anything to do with colonialism and race? And, you know, I've had these sort of weird kind of referee reviews in the past asking me these kind of questions. And here it was, you know, the literature and the conceptual fitting was so, you know, it was just so, it didn't need explanation. So coming back to some of the things that have been constantly going on in this seminar about intimacy and social distance, I think what Shamita has said, hers is a real contribution. Her pragmatic intimacy is a really fantastic contribution to the literature. But also, this intimacy and social distance, we have also seen this in so many different contexts of empire. For example, Anne Stoller's work on those tense and tender ties that she keeps talking about, the tensions and the power relations and the intimacy. It seems to be very common across empires. The other thing is that when it comes to the post-colonial moment, which I engage with as an anthropologist, I find it very sort of interesting to unravel the kind of hypocrisies and the silences when it comes to these employer-employee relationships. Because when I deal with expatriates in my ethnographic context, they're calling them ayahs many times, but they're also calling them employees, and making this kind of shift that we don't have servants, we have employees. They have a contract, they have fixed hours, so it's almost they are painting themselves as these relationships as very non-hierarchical, when their whiteness allows them to move away from these very complex relationships of caste. But in actuality, these are very unequal relationships. So this whole thing of intimacy and social distance and what is hierarchical, what is not hierarchical, and are just things that I think the post-colonial period also represents a really interesting time to understand these shifts and changes and these paradoxes that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions, comments? Abhishek, I see your hand. Yeah.
So just a sort of very quick comment and another question actually that I meant to ask that I forgot to ask. And so the comment is just, just to make it very clear that in a sense, one of my questions was not really, why not subaltern studies, right? But the question was from a broader framework, if we were to sort of think about like the historiography of the world in the last like 50 years, this is, it seems to me, a second serious attempt to deal with questions of, let's say, labor or social dispossession that emerges from South Asia and has a kind of conceptual reach and ambition to address a global framework, right? And so the question for me then becomes, it seems important to articulate very sharply the theoretical innovation and stakes, which raise the possibility of like rejecting the previous model, right? And I think I was sort of gesturing to that by simply saying that the question of servitude itself, by focusing on servitude, it makes it possible to think in a deeper historical sense than subalternity itself would do, right? And so in a sense, it's a more historicizing project in a certain kind of way. And I think that structures the volume itself. But that raises the question of exactly what the links between the deeper past and the colonial past are. And so I just, I just want to hear a little bit more about, this is the sort of rephrasing the question of the weight of the deeper past in the present. I just want to sort of hear how we might overcome the disjuncture, which is a natural disjuncture between different kinds of archives, for instance. There may be laughter in the pre-modern, but what the legal in the pre-modern is not at all clear in the same kind of way as it is in the colonial state, right? So, how do you make the emotional effectiveness or the affective relationships of elite servant in a Rajput court speak to the experience of the mid-19th century Aya, right? Beyond the word of knocker or knockery or chakari, right? So that's the sort of question. And I don't expect that there's necessarily going to be a pat answer to this, but it seems to me that beginning to answer this question would be a way to take this work forward in different ways. And the second question I had, relates to a major conceptual question for the pre-modern period, which is the idea of slavery, right? And so in a sense, there's a kind of like slipping between slavery and servitude, which marks a lot of the pre-modern contributions to this volume. And here I just wanted to ask, I wanted to invite us to think about what the possibility of thinking with servitude itself might do to rethink the categories of slavery, which for us, and because of the scholarship, are largely shaped by the racial capitalism of the Atlantic world from the 17th century onwards.
Thank you, Abhishek. I see Dietrich's hand is raised. Dietrich?
Yeah, thanks. My intervention is more a commentary in the sense that I have not personally worked on domestic servants or servitude, but the structural questions that were raised, I feel are very pertinent also from a perspective of social and political science. What I mean is how governance works. In particular, I related to what I often confronted with, the informality and the formality. The informality and formality of the rules of governance, of law, and of daily regulations that applied. And I think we could perhaps learn a lot from this approach where you are combining the pre-modern period with the modern period and the post-colonial period to make more sense of, so to say, this dialogical or this dialogue between formality and informality in a number of ways, that how one does not kill the other, but where several layers of different modes of operation are overlaying each other. And in a larger structural sense, I feel that's what you, in a sense, are uncovering and are opening, and that could also have an impact for the larger sort of research on the modes of social and political developments in the region, but of course, way beyond.
Catherine? Yeah, Pankaj, I think maybe we collect and then perhaps Catherine?
Thank you very much, both to the Nitins and the discussants, and I like the discussion very much. But I wonder whether the term servant itself is very limiting also with its broader or discussion within broader frameworks of global history. For example, given the fact that we have a global history of domestic and care workers, which seems to include servants and slaves, and in how far do you relate to it, or would that be too broad? This comes back again to the question, how micro should the research be to make a really meaningful contribution to what you had in mind, to uncover as much details as possible. Thank you.
Shall we take one more from Christian before we go to Pankaj? Christian,
Yeah, no, mine was a sort of reaction. I like the idea of discussing, this thing. And I really like the points that Nitin and Jana raised. In a sense, I really didn't want to say that changes in continuity or connections and disconnections, that somehow we should go like only for continuity in a long period or just for connections across space. We should really try to find the ways that are more conducive to really see where there is a disconnection and why. I mean, that's, and therefore also when there is a change in continuity across time or not. So that is why I think, for example, a thematic approach, thematic organization could have helped, not in order to sort of predefine continuity, but exactly to see maybe more unexpected discontinuities eventually. And at the same time, in terms of the, I totally agree with you, Diana, that the question is not just about seeing connections everywhere, but really reflecting why there are these connections, if there are disconnection, etc., etc. The last point was, I always find it fascinating as an Italian, I have to say, that this question of the subaltern, no? Because somehow, as you all know, I mean, Gramsci used subaltern because he was imprisoned and he couldn't use working class. That's the key point because of censorship. But the other ironic thing is that Gramsci, of course, wants us to study the mass consensus to a regime, an authoritarian fascist regime. That was the point, and somehow the concept has shifted into the direction of this sort of agency where the subalterns are always like acting against the grain of political regimes. It's a very interesting dynamics. I'm not the first one to discover this, but it's maybe nice to remind this, because this is again, there is a tension there historiographically and politically that it's interesting to think about when we do this kind of operation of looking from below, etc. No, the point is not just how the subalterns break or oppose or resist, but also how they reproduce in the everyday practices and the everyday discourses they do the power of the whole system, if you want. And now this is also true for the elites and all the other groups in society. So these were just some ideas just to react and be part of the conversation, and not just like being a sort of parachuting discussant in the conversation.
Thank you. Pankaj?
Thank you, Christian, for those comments, because I think that was one of the issues that I, for example, had missed while responding first time on the question of subaltern agency. And I would just like to add to, there's no disagreement here, but I would just like to add to this that one of the things that one does when one looks for agency is also to simply reconstruct and recover some of the glimpses of such lives. Uh, Again, looking at another great Italian historian, Carlo Ginzburg's work, what he recovers is neither reproduction nor resistance, but simply a very charming moment that tells us much more than what stereotypical notions of reproduction of the power relation or resistance and rupture can actually tell us. And that is the strength of focusing on the lives rather than on the categories, on the premeditated categories. That kind of historiographical practice of focusing on the lives can actually yield to us much more precious bits, even if they might on discovery first appear to be very minor. And it is from that perspective that I also want to approach this a much larger, very profound question, something that goes beyond the immediate project that we are talking about, which Abhishek raised, which is these linear, these connections between the pre-modern and the modern. One of the problems, one of the problems that all of us as historians, as well as social scientists and humanists face, is this idea of the deep past. and how it continues to live on and live into our contemporary lives. And from that perspective, from the opposite perspective, all histories are, if all histories are contemporary history, in the sense that the very idea, for example, of the pre-modernity, the very idea of modernity, pre-modernity, early modernity, ancient, medieval, these are all modern ideas. These are all contemporary ideas. We want to make sense of our world, but when we apply our own very willful historiographical categories which have emerged actually post 18th century. So not just in the colonial, but even in the metropolitan world, actually the epistemological shifts that took place between the 17th and the 19th centuries has completely restructured the knowledge systems within which we operate. And hence, one of the challenges of recovering the past it ensues from it issues from the fact that all our categories are modern categories. So to uncover the pre-modern becomes then the impossible task of kind of recovering pre-modernity in spite of and yet through the modern and contemporary. So I mean, this double task practically looks impossible. And that's why it's so important for us to continuously keep shifting between the emic categories and the etic categories. That's why the slippage between the slavery and the servitude, the slippage between the servant and the slave, and of course also this anxiety about the impossible capaciousness of the term servant, and hence the continuous footnoting of the qualifications, and the fact that we don't want to make it completely capacious. We want to talk about knocker, we want to talk about the khasa, we want to talk about the mulajim and so on, and want to recover those specifics, and yet we have to use these modern sounding terminologies and keep chipping at them in order to convey a truer, a better, a more clear, specific sense, historiographically speaking. And that's something that will continue to be apologetic in some senses. But so long as we are sensitive to the fact that we are working with impossible categories, and yet we cannot make sense except in those categories, we will have to be, perennially self-reflexive about that. And lastly, the question of servants and servitude slippage can also, slavery and servitude slippage could also be one way, again, could also be to simply focus on the real life narratives wherever it is available. That might be one way of running clear of the categories bind, especially the etic categories bind. I understand that one cannot run very far with that. One has to, in order to make sense, one has to come back to the etic, to the emic, to the etic categories. But at least we would have recovered some of the past, not in their pristine purity, but at least in the sense in which we could relate to it and yet do minimum possible violence to its sovereignty. So I guess it is a very, very difficult task, and this project made us realize that difficulty to get the pre-modern archives talk to the modern archives. And many of the differences, as Abhishek rightly noticed, many of the differences in the way we pitch the pre-modern times history relative to the modern times history actually emanate from those archival differences that we could not overcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will give the last to Nitin, and Nitin can now solve all the problems which we have discussed in next 3 to 4 minutes.
I'll just take up some
So,
specific queries which were made now, but also earlier, sort of coming back to what Christian was mentioning about these tensions that he finds. This is written by certain tensions about sort of two aspects that he raised on questions of agency and periodization. Sort of this chronological or thematic, and sort of clearly segregating sort of pre-modern and modern, sort of reproduces in some ways the older paradigm. So which we definitely don't want to at least we suggest that kind of a sort of it has a bearing on each other. We want to sort of interrogate that without sort of assuming that kind of separation. So yeah, that's I think that's pretty valid what you're saying, and one needs to think about though we definitely wanted to kind of have this conversation, but the fact that the books are organized in a certain way also might seem to suggest a certain idea about why we tend to do that. So yeah, that's about agency, because the thing is as you see that how we take up this question is very different. Sort of different authors have used their own sort of there are no driving conceptions here which on methodology on terms. So there are internal sort of conversations and differentiations in how we take up this question. But yeah, but if I can sort of, because me and Nitin have been having this conversation for a long time, so in our sort of conception, we definitely were thinking through more social historical kind of approaches, right? Sort of social historical, not necessarily in the 60s sense, but like more updated sort of. But social history was definitely the sort of the main sort of, if one can think about the discipline through which we were thinking about this was, and that's why this the idea of talking about the servant, the embodied servant, not just servitude, of course, comes out of that kind of interest. So social history becomes a major sort of field in which we wanted to have this, but we realize the challenges are different if you're talking about different periods of history. So for social history, what it means to a modern historian is very different, considering a very different sort of set of material with which people working on different regions or time periods work. So yeah, we understand that, and yeah, so in some ways yeah, there are the internal sort of tensions also in terms of how we understand concepts or even key historiographical fields, which is evident. We won't just like to carry this conversation forward. Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry. A couple of other things about this question about use of the term. Why do we use this term domestic servant and not a more sort of quote unquote global categories like care work or care worker? Of course, it also sort of has the imprint of how the project was conceived. So very much, we were working on a colonial period, colonial archive in a specific project in which this term evidently is more sort of used. And so in some ways we started sort of conceptualizing precisely. So that has a bearing on how we initially came up with the term and which term we want, how we wanted.
No, we lost you for a bit, for a few seconds.
Oh, yeah, but I was just, I don't know if you got my point about this, why we chose the term.
You are getting stuck. Maybe now it's time to really wrap up. So no, but Nitin, do you have, if you have any couple of any serious points to make? Otherwise, maybe we just
that's it. Yeah.
Okay. Then thanks a lot to all of you. Thanks again to Abhishek and Christian and everyone. I mean, yeah, I think this is just the beginning. If you think of the work on servants or servitude in South Asia along this long time period, and we'll be very happy if more works actually now emerge. Yeah, that's all.